Every night, without choosing to, we step across a border into a world built entirely by our own minds, a place where memories rearrange themselves into stories, where impossible landscapes feel familiar, and where the deepest parts of us speak in symbols we don't fully understand. For centuries, dreams were treated as messages from gods or meaningless noise from a sleeping brain. But now, science is beginning to uncover their hidden logic from electrical storms. Inside the cortex to strange quantum whispers that might shape consciousness itself. What if your nightly visions aren't random at all, but vital clues to how your mind learns, heals, and even touches the fabric of reality? Tonight, we'll follow those clues into the brain's darkest chambers and beyond, to ask the question that has haunted humanity for millennia: what are dreams really? When the world grows quiet and darkness folds itself gently over the edges of the day, something remarkable begins to happen inside the human body. The steady rhythms of waking life start to slow, heart rate drops, muscles loosen, and the rush of thought that once filled the mind with plans and worries begins to soften into something less defined. Sleep does not fall upon us all at once, but rather pulls us under layer by layer. In a slow and ancient ritual that every person experiences and yet few truly understand. The body, which only moments ago responded to every sound and movement around it, now surrenders its vigilance. The senses withdraw, the eyes close, and what follows is a journey into a landscape that belongs entirely to the mind itself. The first stage is deceptively simple, a drifting state known as light sleep, where one might still hear a sound from the hallway or feel the weight of a blanket shift. But beneath this surface calm, the brain is already changing its behavior in profound ways. Waves of electrical activity, once fast and sharp, stretch and lengthen, forming slower rhythms that sweep across the cortex. In the early 20th century, researchers like Hans Berger in Germany began to record these patterns using a new tool called the electroencephalograph, or EEG, which transformed invisible thought into lines of ink on paper. In 1929, Berger's first published IG readings revealed the existence of alpha waves, gentle pulses of electricity that rolled through the resting brain and hinted that sleep was far more dynamic than anyone had guessed. As the night deepens, the sleeper descends further, passing through distinct stages that repeat in cycles lasting roughly 90 minutes each. During the deeper phases, known as slow-wave sleep, the body reaches its lowest point of activity. Breathing slows, blood pressure drops, and the immune system strengthens itself. These are the hours when the body repairs tissue, consolidates energy, and prepares for the coming day. Yet even in these heavy hours, the brain is not idle. It sorts and stores memories, linking new experiences to old knowledge, and it quietly rehearses patterns of movement and emotion, as if preparing for challenges that have not yet arrived. Then, without warning, the rhythm changes again. After perhaps 90 minutes, the sleeper enters a strange and vivid state that researchers in the mid-20th century would come to call rapid eye movement, or REM sleep. It was in 1953 that a young graduate student named Eugene Oserinsky, working late in a sleep laboratory at the University of Chicago, noticed the eyes of his son darting beneath closed lids while the boy was still deeply asleep. Oserinsky recorded the phenomenon and shared his discovery with physiologist Nathaniel Kleitman, and together they realized they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. During REM sleep, the body becomes almost entirely paralyzed, muscles held still by the brainstem's commands, yet the mind bursts into activity as intense as any waking moment. The eyes dart rapidly back and forth, as if watching scenes unfold inside a private cinema. The heart beats faster, breathing becomes shallow and irregular. The brain's electrical patterns resemble those of a person wide awake. Most importantly, this is the stage when dreams, the immersive, story-like experiences that have fascinated humans for millennia, are most likely to occur. Behind the still mask of a sleeper's face, entire worlds rise and dissolve, built not from the physical materials of the outside world, but from memories, emotions, and fragments of imagination stitched together into new and surprising forms. In the early days of sleep science, before the mechanisms were understood, Researchers would watch in fascination from the edges of darkened rooms. They saw volunteers twitch and whisper, their eyes moving beneath the lids as if following invisible action. They woke them gently at different points in the night and asked what they had seen. Again and again, those woken during REM spoke of dreams, sometimes mundane, sometimes bizarre, often deeply emotional. Those woken during other stages rarely remembered anything at all. By the late 1950s, the link between REM sleep and dreaming was undeniable. And with it came a new way of thinking about the sleeping mind, not as a passive state of rest, but as a dynamic process in which the brain continues its most complex work, even as the body lies motionless. Today, decades after Asarinsky's accidental discovery, scientists know that an average adult cycles through 4 to 6 REM periods every night, each longer than the last, with the final one lasting up to 40 minutes before dawn. Mapped how regions like the limbic system, the seat of emotion, become unusually active during dreaming, while the prefrontal cortex, which governs logic and planning, grows quiet. This balance might explain why dreams are often filled with vivid feelings, yet obey few of the strict rules that shape waking thought. Yet even with modern tools and knowledge, the beginning of each night remains a kind of miracle. As darkness returns and the body slips gently into sleep, the brain prepares itself for work no less important than what it does in daylight. It will clean and organize, repair and rebuild, but it will also create weaving stories that seem to come from nowhere. Stories that sometimes reveal hidden fears or hopes. Stories that, in rare moments, solve problems or spark inventions. All of it begins with that quiet surrender to night, when the mind, no longer bound by the waking world, wakes in its own mysterious way. When scientists first tried to peer into the sleeping mind, they had no maps to guide them, no instruments that could capture the hidden rhythms moving beneath the skin. For centuries, sleep had been understood mostly through outward signs: closed eyes, still bodies, slowed breath, and even the most careful observers could only guess at what was happening inside. That began to change in the early decades of the 20th century, when a German psychiatrist named Hans Berger set out to listen to the brain itself. Berger, born in 1873 in the small town of Neuses, near Coburg, had been fascinated since his student days by the idea that thoughts and emotions might leave measurable traces, that the brain, like a telegraph sending messages through invisible wires, might broadcast its workings in the form of electrical signals. In the 1920s, Berger began a series of experiments that would transform the study of sleep and consciousness forever. Using delicate electrodes placed on the scalp and connected to sensitive amplifiers, he recorded faint oscillations of electricity signals, measured in millionths of a volt, that pulsed steadily even when the subject lay still. In 1924, he succeeded in capturing the first human electroencephalogram, or EEG, a term he coined from the Greek words for electric writing. These early recordings were crude by modern standards, often interrupted by noise and distorted by the limitations of the equipment, but they were revolutionary. For the first time, the human brain's activity could be traced second by second, not only while awake, but also during sleep. Berger noticed that the brain did not hum with a single steady rhythm. Instead, it produced different patterns that varied with mood, attention, and state of consciousness. One of the first he identified he called the alpha wave, a smooth, rhythmic oscillation of about 8 to 13 cycles per second that appeared when a person was relaxed but awake, eyes closed and mind at ease. When the subject opened their eyes or focused on a task, this alpha rhythm would vanish, replaced by faster, more chaotic activity. Later, when scientists recorded people during deep sleep, they observed even slower waves, large rolling patterns called delta waves, occurring fewer than 4 times per second. That marked the body's descent into its most restorative stages. As these discoveries spread across Europe and America in the 1930s, a new picture of the sleeping brain began to form. Sleep was not, as many had assumed, a single uniform state. Instead, it was a shifting landscape of electrical activity, each stage defined by its own signature rhythm. Researchers such as Frederick Gibbs and William Lennox in the United States and Lord Adrian in Britain refined Berger's techniques, building more accurate amplifiers and developing standardized ways to interpret the jagged lines of the EEG. They learned that a typical night's sleep followed a predictable sequence, drifting from light stages dominated by alpha waves into deeper stages with slow, towering delta waves, then rising again into the rapid, complex activity that accompanied dreaming. This knowledge did more than satisfy scientific curiosity. It began to reshape how doctors understood illness and how they treated patients. In the past, many sleep-related conditions, from insomnia to epilepsy, had been mysterious and poorly defined, often explained in vague psychological terms. With EEG, physicians could see objective evidence of abnormal patterns. They could watch, for example, how the brains of epileptic patients erupted into sudden bursts of synchronized activity, or how insomniacs failed to generate the slow waves needed for restorative rest. Hospitals built specialized sleep laboratories where patients spent the night hooked up to electrodes, their every neural fluctuation recorded and analyzed. The idea that the brain was active, even busy during sleep, also changed cultural attitudes. For centuries, sleep had been seen mainly as a passive state, a period when the body simply shut down to conserve energy. But Berger's electric songs, as some early writers poetically called them, suggested something else entirely. The mind was not turned off at night. It was engaged in a complex, carefully orchestrated process that scientists were only beginning to understand. Each wave and pulse recorded on the paper scroll was evidence of memory being sorted, connections being strengthened, and the body being restored. By the late 1930s, EEG had become an essential tool not only in sleep research, but in neurology, psychiatry, and even psychology. It helped reveal how the brain matured over a lifetime, how infant sleep was dominated by rapid waves that changed as they grew older, how aging brought a decline in the slow wave stages that once defined deep rest. It also opened the door to new questions about consciousness itself. If sleep could be mapped in such detail, might waking thought be mapped too? Could the subtle transitions between drowsiness and dreaming, awareness and unconsciousness, be captured and understood through these delicate tracings? What began as one man's strange idea in a small German clinic had, by the eve of World War II, grown into a global scientific movement. The EEG, with its looping wave-like patterns, offered the first true map of the midnight brain, a map still being refined today with far more sophisticated tools, but one that remains rooted in Berger's patient, painstaking work nearly a century ago. It showed that sleep was not a void but a landscape alive with rhythm and change, a place where the mind spoke in electric pulses long before the dreamer could speak of what they had seen. And in listening to those quiet songs, science took its first steps toward understanding one of the deepest mysteries of human existence. By the middle of the 20th century, scientists had mapped the broad terrain of sleep, the slow waves, the deep stages, the shifting cycles that repeated through the night. But something fundamental was still missing. The brain's patterns could be traced and labeled, yet the vivid inner world of dreaming remained mysterious, unreachable, and unmeasured. That changed in 1953, when a young graduate student named Eugene Oserinsky, working under physiologist Nathaniel Kleitman at the University of Chicago, stumbled upon a discovery that would transform the field forever. Late one night, as he watched a volunteer sleeping in the lab, Oserinsky noticed the man's eyes darting rapidly beneath his closed eyelids. At first he assumed it was a mistake, perhaps. The electrodes were slipping or his machine was malfunctioning, but the strange movement repeated itself, again and again, following a regular rhythm unlike anything he had seen before. Curious, Oserinsky began waking subjects when these bursts of eye movement occurred and asking what they remembered. The results were astonishing. Over and over, people described intense, detailed dreams, stories with plots, characters, fears, and emotions. In contrast, those awakened during other phases of sleep often recalled nothing more than vague thoughts or fleeting impressions. It quickly became clear that these rapid eye movements, or rearranges, marked a unique state of consciousness, one in which the body lay still and seemingly lifeless. but the mind was as alive and active as in waking life. Isarinsky and Kleitman published their findings in the journal Science that same year. And the quiet world of sleep research exploded into something far more dynamic and dramatic than anyone had expected. The discovery of REM sleep overturned old assumptions about what happened during the night. Until then, scientists believed sleep was largely a period of rest and inactivity, a time when the body slowed down to repair itself and the mind switched off. But the new evidence told a very different story. During REM, the sleeper's heart rate and breathing became irregular. Their blood pressure rose and their brainwaves closely resembled those of someone awake and alert. Yet, in a curious twist, the body itself was paralyzed. Most skeletal muscles were locked in a state known as atonia, preventing the dreamer from physically acting out what they experienced in their mind. This strange combination, intense mental activity, coupled with bodily stillness, fascinated researchers and quickly became one of the central puzzles of modern neuroscience. Sleep laboratories across the United States, Europe, and Japan began replicating Isarinsky's work. Michel Jouvet, a French neurophysiologist, conducted experiments in the late 1950s that added another layer to the story. By surgically disabling the part of the brainstem that caused muscle paralysis during REM, he allowed cats to move while they dreamed, and the animals began stalking, pouncing, and grooming in their sleep as if chasing imaginary prey. This provided dramatic evidence that dreams were not just random mental noise but coordinated, embodied simulations of real behavior, rehearsals of actions the brain might later need when awake. The revelation that dreams were tied so closely to this distinct physiological state also captured the public imagination. Newspapers and radio programs in the 1950s and 1960s eagerly reported on the new science of dreaming, portraying sleep not as a passive escape from life, but as an active, creative part of it. People were fascinated by the idea that their most private, surreal experiences were linked to measurable biological processes, eye movements, brain rhythms, muscle paralysis, that could be observed and studied in a laboratory. It was as if a hidden dimension of the human mind had been brought into the light. The new field of dream science grew rapidly. Researchers began mapping the precise timing of REM cycles, discovering that they occurred roughly every 90 minutes and became longer and more frequent toward morning. They found that newborns spent as much as half of their sleep time in REM, while adults averaged about 20 to 25%, suggesting that dreaming played a role in brain development. They documented how certain medications suppressed REM sleep and how its absence led to mood changes, cognitive deficits, and even hallucinations, indicating that the dreaming state was essential for mental health. As the evidence accumulated, theories about the function of dreams shifted. Sigmund Freud's earlier view that dreams were disguised expressions of unconscious desires did not disappear entirely, but it was now joined by new scientific ideas. Some researchers proposed that dreaming helped consolidate memories, weaving new experiences into the fabric of long-term knowledge. Others suggested it allowed the brain to process emotions, diffuse trauma, or rehearse problem-solving strategies. Still others saw dreams as a kind of neurological housekeeping, a byproduct of the brain reorganizing itself during the night. Whatever the ultimate explanation, the REM discovery made clear that dreaming was not an accidental quirk of sleep, but one of its most fundamental expressions. By the 1960s and 1970s, the REM revolution had reshaped medicine and psychology. Sleep clinics began diagnosing disorders like narcolepsy and REM behavior disorder, conditions that revealed the delicate balance between mind and body in the dream state. Experiments using IG and later more advanced imaging techniques showed how specific brain regions, the limbic system, responsible for emotion, and the visual cortex, which builds mental imagery, flared into activity during REM. Even as areas responsible for logic and planning remained quiet, this pattern explained why dreams often felt emotionally intense but illogical, filled with vivid scenes that defied the rules of waking life. The transformation of sleep science in the wake of Isarinsky's discovery was nothing short of profound. What had once been considered a nightly shutdown was now understood as a complex and essential process. with REM sleep at its heart, a time when the body surrendered to stillness, but the mind roamed free across landscapes of memory, emotion, and imagination. And while much about dreaming remains mysterious even today, the events of 1953 marked a turning point, a moment when science first caught the mind in the act of creating its own world behind closed eyes. And the quiet darkness of sleep became one of the most fascinating frontiers of human exploration. When scientists first began to take sleep seriously as a subject worthy of careful study, the work could not be done in ordinary spaces. It required rooms that could control every variable: temperature, light, sound, even the subtle vibrations from the outside world, because the slightest disturbance might change how the brain behaved during the night. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the first dedicated sleep laboratories were being built in universities and hospitals across Europe and the United States. These were not the cold clinical spaces of ordinary medical wards, but carefully designed environments meant to resemble bedrooms, though with a strange and slightly unsettling edge. The walls were often lined with soundproof padding. The lighting was dim and tinted red to avoid disrupting natural sleep cycles, and heavy doors sealed off the rooms from outside noise. In the center of each chamber sat a simple bed, surrounded not by bedside tables and books, but by tangled bundles of wires leading to machines that hummed and ticked. Softly in the background, every patient who entered one of these rooms became a participant in a new kind of science. Electrodes were glued to the scalp to record brainwaves, straps wrapped around the chest to measure breathing, sensors placed on the chin and limbs tracked muscle tone and movement. Technicians watched quietly from an adjacent room, their eyes fixed on screens and chart recorders that turned invisible biological processes into flowing lines of ink and light. It was in these dim, red-lit laboratories that the modern science of sleep truly took shape. For the first time, researchers could observe what happened second by second inside a human body that appeared to be resting, yet was, in truth, undergoing a complex and highly structured sequence of events. One of the most striking experiments of this era came from a French neurophysiologist named Michel Jouvet, whose work in Lyon during the late 1950s and 1960s would fundamentally change scientists understood dreaming. Jouvet was fascinated by a peculiar feature of REM sleep, the near-total paralysis that prevented sleepers from acting out the vivid experiences their brains were generating. He hypothesized that this paralysis was controlled by a small region in the brainstem that sent inhibitory signals to the muscles during REM. To test his theory, he performed a series of experiments on cats, carefully removing or disabling this specific region. The results were both startling and revealing. The cats, which would normally lie motionless during REM, began to move. They walked, crouched, stalked, and even pounced, all while still asleep. They were, it seemed, acting out their dreams. This discovery was more than a fascinating curiosity. It was a window into the purpose of dreaming itself. If animals rehearse complex behaviors while asleep, perhaps dreams were not random nonsense, but rather a kind of internal training ground, a place where the brain practiced skills and strategies without the risks and costs of the waking world. Jouvet's findings added weight to an emerging theory that REM sleep might serve an adaptive function, preparing animals, and by extension humans, for challenges they might one day face: hunting, fleeing, navigating. And social interaction could all be rehearsed in this safe, simulated environment, strengthening neural circuits and improving performance when those situations arose in real life. Yet rehearsal was only one possible explanation, and as more data poured in from sleep laboratories, new questions emerged. Some researchers argued that REM paralysis was not about rehearsal at all, but about protection. If the brain was capable of creating such vivid and convincing simulations, then without a mechanism to paralyze the body, those dreams could become dangerous. A sleeper might leap from a bed, injure themselves, or lash out at an unseen threat. The paralysis, in this view, was a necessary safeguard, an evolutionary solution to the problem of a mind that continued to act even while the body rested. Others proposed a more internal role for dreams, suggesting that the strange narratives unfolding during sleep were the byproducts of a deeper biological process, the cleansing and reorganization of the brain itself. During REM, they argued, the brain might be pruning unnecessary connections, consolidating important memories, and integrating emotional experiences into a coherent whole. The stories that played out, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying, were simply the surface effects of this hidden housekeeping. The laboratories of the mid-20th century became the stage on which these debates unfolded. Researchers like Alan Rechtschaffen in Chicago, William Dement at Stanford, and Juvit and Lyon spent long nights watching the flickering traces of IG lines and the rhythmic rise and fall of chest monitors. They cataloged the subtle shifts in eye movement, the bursts of heart rate, the waves of neural activity that swept across the cortex during each phase of sleep. They woke participants at precise moments and recorded their dream reports. Comparing them to the physiological data they had collected, patterns began to emerge. Dreams became longer and more complex as the night went on. Emotional content intensified in later REM cycles, and memory recall was often improved when REM sleep was undisturbed. By the early 1970s, the image of sleep as mere rest had been completely overturned. It was now understood as a dynamic process involving intricate choreography between body and brain, a time when physical stillness masked extraordinary internal activity. The padded rooms, the red lights, and the humming machines had revealed that sleep was not a void, but a laboratory of its own, a place where the mind experimented, repaired and prepared itself for the world it would meet when morning returned. And though many of the great questions that began in those rooms remain open, why exactly we dream, how those dreams shape us, and what deeper purposes they serve, the work of that era laid the foundation for everything we know today about the hidden life of the sleeping brain. Each night, as the body surrenders to sleep and the conscious mind lets go of the day's concerns, a quieter and deeper process unfolds inside the hidden folds of the brain, a process that, in many ways, resembles the building of entire cities from scattered fragments. Scientists studying memory have long known that the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure tucked deep within the temporal lobe, plays a central role in storing and organizing our experiences. But it is during sleep, and especially during dreaming, that this structure seems to take on an almost architectural role, sorting through the vast tangle of recent impressions and older knowledge, filing some pieces neatly away while discarding others and stitching them together into new, often bizarre combinations that form the landscapes of our dreams. What we experience is strange dream worlds, streets that loop back on themselves, faces that change mid-conversation, houses that seem to merge into childhood classrooms. Are the brain's way of exploring memory not as static storage but as living, shifting networks? Researchers observing these nightly processes have found that the hippocampus replays patterns of neural activity that were first laid down during waking experience, a phenomenon documented in laboratory animals as early as the 1990s by scientists like Matthew Wilson and Bruce McNaughton. In their studies, rats trained to run a maze showed specific sequences of neuron firing while navigating it. And later, during sleep, those same sequences fired again, often at a much faster pace, as if the animal were rehearsing the memory in miniature. In humans, similar patterns appear, though with even greater complexity, weaving together not just spatial information, but emotions, faces, and narratives. The dreams that result may feel surreal or even nonsensical, but beneath that surface strangeness lies a deep logic. The brain is trying to integrate new knowledge into its existing framework, to make sense of the past day by connecting it with everything that came before. This connection between dreaming and memory has occasionally spilled over into the waking world in dramatic ways. One of the most famous examples belongs to Dmitry Mendeleev, the Russian chemist who, in 1869, struggling to find order in the growing list of known chemical elements, he spent weeks arranging and rearranging cards with atomic weights, searching for a pattern that made sense, but the solution eluded him. Exhausted, he fell asleep at his desk, and when he awoke, he claimed the solution had come to him in a dream. The elements, he realized, could be arranged not by their properties alone, but by their atomic weights in a repeating sequence, a structure we now know as the periodic table. Another iconic case is that of August Kekol, the German chemist who, in the 1860s, was attempting to decipher the structure of benzene. Legend has it that one evening, dozing in front of a fire, he dreamed of a snake biting its own tail, forming a circle. When he awoke, he understood that benzene's atoms formed a ring, a discovery that transformed organic chemistry. Such stories, while rare, hint at the deeper purpose of dreaming as a space where the mind can solve problems in ways that conscious reasoning cannot. During waking hours, our thoughts tend to follow well-worn paths, constrained by logic, habit, and expectation. But in dreams, those constraints loosen. The hippocampus and neocortex combine fragments of memory in novel ways, forging unexpected connections that can lead to creative insights. It is a mental workshop that operates without supervision, exploring possibilities that the rational mind might dismiss. Yet dreams are not only a forge for invention. They are also a vault where the past, even the painful past, can reemerge. Psychologists have long observed that memories suppressed during waking life, particularly those tied to trauma, often resurface in dreams, sometimes years or decades after the original events. These reappearances can be fragmented or symbolic, their meaning disguised by metaphor and distortion, but their emotional weight is unmistakable. In the 1970s and 1980s, clinicians working with veterans of the Vietnam War documented recurring dreams in which soldiers relived firefights, ambushes, or the faces of those they had lost. These were not simple replays of memory, but complex reconstructions in which the mind seemed to be grappling with experiences it could not fully process while awake. The idea that dreams might help integrate trauma has led some researchers to propose that they serve a kind of emotional regulation function by reactivating painful memories in a safe, internal environment. The brain may gradually reduce their sting, a process known as extinction learning. There is evidence that REM sleep, the phase most associated with vivid dreaming, dampens the release of stress-related neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, creating a chemical environment that allows difficult memories to be re-encoded in less distressing forms. In this sense, forgotten cities built each night are not just collections of memory fragments, but therapeutic landscapes, where the psyche attempts to rebuild itself after damage. Dreams, then, are neither random nor meaningless. They are the byproducts of one of the brain's most essential tasks, the continuous reorganization of memory and identity. The hippocampus acts as an archivist, cataloging the details of daily life. The neocortex serves as a builder, stitching those details into larger narratives. And the dreaming mind roams through the resulting structures, exploring them not as data, but as lived experience. In those explorations, insights can emerge, old wounds can surface and heal, and the raw material of memory can be transformed into the architecture of understanding. When we wake, much of this work remains hidden, its results folded invisibly into who we are and how we think. But every now and then, in a flash of inspiration, a forgotten detail recalled, a long-buried feeling stirred, we catch a glimpse of those forgotten cities, and we realize that the mind never truly sleeps. Long before laboratories and electrodes, before anyone spoke of neurons or rapid eye movements, humans were already paying close attention to the strange stories that unfolded behind their eyes each night. Dreams were never considered random or meaningless in the ancient world. They were regarded as messages, prophecies, warnings, or gifts sent from beyond the limits of ordinary perception. To understand a dream was to glimpse the hidden structure of reality. And across cultures and centuries, people developed elaborate ways to record, interpret, and even summon these mysterious visions. The oldest written evidence of this comes from Mesopotamia, where clay tablets dating as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE preserve lists of dreams and their supposed meanings. These early records, etched in cuneiform and discovered in places like Nineveh and Mari, show that dreams were categorized and analyzed much like the movement of stars or the flight of birds. A lion appearing in a dream might foretell victory in battle, A flood might signal divine anger. These interpretations were not just idle speculation, but were taken seriously by kings and priests, who believed that the gods spoke most directly through the language of sleep. In ancient Egypt, dreams occupied a similarly sacred place. Temples dedicated to specific gods, such as Serapis and Imhotep, were known as places of dream incubation, where people seeking guidance would spend the night in hopes of receiving visions. Priests kept detailed dream manuals, some of which survive on papyrus from around 1200 BCE, listing hundreds of possible dream scenarios and their meanings. A dream of eating crocodile meat, one such text advised, meant that good fortune was coming. A dream of one's teeth falling out was a warning of death in the family. Dreams were not only predictive, but also diagnostic. They were seen as a means for the divine to reveal illnesses and their cures. They often guided decisions about everything from building projects to political alliances. Pharaohs, whose legitimacy depended on divine favor, took their dreams as literal messages from the gods, shaping policies and military campaigns according to what they saw in the night. The Greeks inherited and expanded this tradition, weaving dream interpretation into the fabric of religion, medicine, and philosophy. The practice of incubation became especially prominent in the cult of Asclepius, the god of healing. At temples dedicated to him, such as the sanctuary at Epidaurus, pilgrims seeking relief from illness would sleep overnight in a special chamber known as the abaton, where they hoped to receive dreams that revealed cures. Priests trained in dream interpretation would then help the dreamer understand the message and prescribe treatments. But dreams in Greece were not limited to medicine. Philosophers like Aristotle speculated about their origins, suggesting in his treatise on dreams that they were echoes of sensory impressions lingering after sleep. At the same time, poets and oracles treated them as glimpses into divine will. It was said that Alexander the Great, before founding the city of Alexandria in 331 BCE, dreamed of a bearded man, quoting Homer, a vision he took as a sign that the site he had chosen was blessed by the gods. The Romans, practical and politically minded, were no less attentive to dreams. Generals on campaign frequently consulted dream interpreters before battles, and their decisions sometimes hinged on what they had seen in the night. The historian Suetonius records that Emperor Augustus once delayed an invasion after dreaming of a broken bridge, interpreting it as a warning from Jupiter. Cicero, though skeptical of superstition, admitted that many dreams seemed too accurate to dismiss, recounting stories of soldiers who dreamed of ambushes that came true and senators saw their deaths foretold days before they occurred. Even in the legal sphere, dreams were sometimes cited as evidence of divine disapproval, influencing court decisions and public policy. The thread connecting all these civilizations was the belief that dreams were not confined to the private workings of the mind, but were part of a larger conversation between humanity and the cosmos. To dream was to step briefly into a realm where the ordinary rules of time and causality did not apply, where past, present, and future could mingle freely, and where gods, ancestors, and unseen forces could communicate directly with mortals. This belief shaped not only individual lives, but also the course of empires. Battles were fought or avoided because of dreams. Temples were built, laws enacted, and cities founded on the strength of night visions. The boundary between sleep and waking life was porous, and events in one realm were thought to shape outcomes in the other, even as science would later strip dreams of their overtly divine associations. The cultural weight of these ancient practices continues to echo in modern life. We still speak of dreams as messages, still search them for meaning, still believe they reveal something deeper than the random firings of neurons. The Mesopotamian kings consulting clay tablets, the Egyptian priests interpreting crocodiles and teeth, the Greek pilgrims lying in dark chambers awaiting Asclepius's healing touch. All of them belonged to a world where dreams were not just fragments of memory or imagination, but signals from deep time, threads woven into the vast fabric of fate. And though our language for them has changed, their pull remains the same, a reminder that, in sleep, we may still hear whispers from realms beyond our waking understanding. The connection between dreams and the deepest parts of human experience becomes most visible when the mind is pushed to its breaking point. And nowhere is this more evident than in the nightmares of war. For as long as men have fought, they have carried the battlefield home with them in their sleep, reliving moments of terror and chaos that their waking minds struggled to contain. But it was only in the early 20th century, amid the unprecedented slaughter of the First World War, that science began to take these recurring visions seriously, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of trauma. The soldiers who returned from the trenches of France and Belgium were not just scarred in body but haunted in dreams. Many awoke screaming, drenched in sweat, certain they were still under artillery fire or trapped in the mud of no man's land. Physicians at the time called the condition shell shock, believing it was caused by physical damage to the brain from exploding shells. But as the war dragged on, and the number of sufferers grew into the hundreds of thousands, it became clear that many showed no sign of injury. The wounds were deeper, harder to see, and often revealed themselves most vividly at night. Reports from field hospitals and veterans clinics describe soldiers jolting awake as if still under attack, diving beneath beds at the sound of thunder, or shouting the names of fallen comrades in their sleep. These nightmares were not simple memories replayed. They were fragments of experience stitched together by fear and guilt, woven into stories that the conscious mind could not or would not tell. Over time, doctors like Charles Myers in Britain and Thomas Salmon in the United States began to argue that these disturbances were psychological. Rooted in the overwhelming stress of modern mechanized warfare, their work laid the foundations for what would eventually be called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, though that term would not be coined until decades later. The Second World War and the conflicts that followed only deepened the mystery of how trauma lodges itself in the dreaming mind. Veterans returning from the Pacific and European theaters often reported the same patterns: repetitive nightmares, often nearly identical each time, in which they relived battles, bombings, or the deaths of comrades. By the time of the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 1970s, psychiatrists like Robert J. Lifton and Khayyam Shaitan were documenting the profound ways in which these dreams shaped veterans' identities. Some described waking from sleep convinced they were still in the jungle, crawling on their bellies across their living room floors. Others spoke of seeing the faces of civilians or fellow soldiers they had killed, not as memories, but as living presences that visited them night after night. The dreams were relentless, and they often blurred the line between past and present, making it impossible for survivors to leave the war behind. Modern neuroscience has begun to shed light on why trauma so often resurfaces in dreams and why it refuses to fade with time. REM sleep, the stage most closely associated with vivid dreaming, appears to play a central role in processing emotional experiences. During REM activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center spikes dramatically, while the prefrontal cortex, which governs logic and judgment, becomes less active. This combination creates a unique environment where intense feelings can be revisited and reprocessed without the usual constraints of rational thought. Some researchers believe that this is the brain's attempt to make sense of overwhelming experiences, to file them into memory in a way that no longer poses a constant threat. But when trauma is too great, the process can fail, leaving the dreamer trapped in a cycle of re-experiencing rather than healing. Studies of veterans over the past several decades have provided powerful evidence for this theory. In the 1990s, clinical psychologist Ernest Hartman conducted sleep studies showing that patients with PTSD often entered REM sleep more quickly and experienced more frequent awakenings, disrupting the brain's ability to complete the emotional housekeeping normally done during that stage. Other research, including work by Murray Raskind at the VA Puget Sound Healthcare System, has shown that medications that dampen the brain's noradrenaline response, a chemical linked to stress, can reduce the frequency and intensity of nightmares, suggesting that excessive arousal during REM interferes with emotional integration. These findings support the idea that nightmares, far from being mere side effects of trauma, are central to how the brain attempts to heal itself, even when those attempts go awry. Yet for many veterans, the consequences of this nightly struggle reach far beyond sleep. Nightmares can reshape identity, influencing how survivors see themselves and the world around them. A soldier who repeatedly dreams of failing to save a comrade may begin to believe he is defined by that failure, even if rationally he knows there was nothing he could have done. Others report that their dreams make them feel permanently anchored to the moment of trauma, unable to build new lives because a part of them remains on the battlefield. In some cases, therapy aims not to eliminate the nightmares, but to change their meaning, a technique known as imagery rehearsal therapy, in which patients consciously rewrite their dream scripts during waking hours, turning helplessness into agency, terror into confrontation. What emerges from this century of observation and research is a picture of dreams as more than passive reflections of trauma. They are active participants in the long, difficult process of recovery, tools the brain uses to wrestle with experiences too heavy for waking consciousness alone. The soldiers of 1916 who trembled at thunder in their sleep, the veterans of 1970 who saw ghosts in their living rooms, the patients in today's clinics who train themselves to reshape their dreams, all are engaged in the same ancient and profoundly human battle. The attempt to reconcile unbearable memory with the need to go on living. And though nightmares may torment those who bear them, they also reveal something crucial about the human mind, that even in its darkest hours, it is still searching for a way to heal. For most of human history, sleep was thought of primarily as a time for rest, a chance for the body to recover its strength, repair damaged tissues, and prepare for the demands of another day. But as neuroscience advanced through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, researchers began to realize that sleep was not only about restoring muscles or replenishing energy, it was also a time when the brain itself performed one of its most essential and delicate tasks, a nightly ritual that involved cleansing, maintenance, and subtle reorganization at the cellular level. In 2012, a team led by neuroscientist Mikan Nedegard at the University of Rochester made a discovery that fundamentally changed how scientists understood this process. They identified what they called the glymphatic system, a network of fluid channels that becomes highly active during sleep and serves as the brain's cleaning crew, flushing out waste products that accumulate during the day and could otherwise damage or disrupt neural function. The name glymphatic was chosen deliberately, echoing the lymphatic system that removes waste from the rest of the body, but with a G added to reflect the involvement of glial cells, the brain's support cells that help regulate this process. Unlike the body's other organs, the brain has no conventional lymphatic system. And for decades, researchers puzzled over how it managed to clear away metabolic debris, such as the toxic proteins beta amyloid and tau, which are associated with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Nedegard's team solved the puzzle by using advanced imaging techniques to watch what happened inside the brains of living mice as they slept. They injected fluorescent tracers into the animals' cerebrospinal fluid and observed, with the help of specialized microscopes, how these glowing molecules flowed through a network of tiny channels surrounding blood vessels, sweeping waste products along with them. The movement was most pronounced during deep sleep, suggesting that the brain had evolved a mechanism to perform its housekeeping when consciousness was offline. The implications of this discovery were profound. It meant that sleep was not just a passive state, but a highly active period of maintenance, during which the brain effectively washed itself. During waking hours, neurons work at full capacity, generating chemical byproducts as they fire and communicate with one another. If these byproducts are not cleared, they can build up over time, leading to inflammation, paired signaling, and possibly disease. The glymphatic system addresses this by expanding the space between brain cells during sleep. Studies showed that this interstitial space can increase by up to 60%, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flow more freely and carry away waste. In this sense, sleep can be thought of as a nightly rinse cycle, essential for cognitive health and longevity. This new understanding also offered fresh insight into why sleep deprivation has such devastating effects on the brain. Chronic lack of sleep has long been linked to memory problems, mood disorders, and an increased risk of neurodegenerative disease. But the underlying mechanisms were not well understood. Now, scientists suspect that without adequate time in deep sleep, the glymphatic system cannot function effectively, leading to the accumulation of harmful substances. Experiments on mice have shown that beta amyloid levels in the brain rise significantly after just a single night of sleep deprivation, and human imaging studies suggest a similar pattern. This has led to a growing interest in the possibility that improving sleep quality could serve as a preventative measure against Alzheimer's and other conditions associated with protein buildup. The discovery of the glymphatic system also raised intriguing questions about the relationship between this cleansing process and the phenomenon of dreaming. If the brain is actively flushing out toxins and reorganizing itself during sleep, could dreams be a kind of byproduct of that work? Mental noise produced by the shifting of neural connections and the pruning of synapses? Some researchers have speculated that as the brain clears out unnecessary chemical signals and reinforces important ones, the patterns of activity that emerge might be experienced subjectively as the strange narratives and vivid images of dreams. In this view, dreams are not the main event, but rather a side effect of the brain's housekeeping, a flickering light, show thrown off by the deeper machinery at work beneath the surface. To explore these ideas further, scientists have continued to experiment with live imaging techniques, often using mice because of their genetic similarity to humans and the ease with which they're small. Thin skulls can be observed under a microscope. In one striking series of experiments, researchers injected fluorescent tracers into the cerebrospinal fluid of sleeping mice and watched as rivers of glowing liquid coursed through the brain, swirling around neurons and washing through the spaces between them. The images captured in real time revealed a dynamic, pulsing system that seemed almost alive, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the animal's heartbeat and breathing. In some cases, the movement slowed or became disrupted when the mice were kept awake, further demonstrating how essential sleep was to the process. These findings have not only reshaped our understanding of what sleep does, but also reframed how we think about the importance of maintaining regular sleep patterns in daily life. The idea that the brain spends the night cleaning itself, sorting and storing information, and perhaps even discarding unnecessary synaptic connections gives new weight to the ancient wisdom that a good night's sleep is vital for mental clarity and health. It also underscores the possibility that the chaotic narratives of our dreams, strange though they may seem, might carry traces of this nightly work, reflecting a deeper biological purpose beneath their surface mystery. Each night, while the conscious self drifts through its shifting dreamscapes, the hidden machinery of the glymphatic system hums quietly in the background, sweeping away the detritus of waking life and preparing the mind for another day of thought, memory, and experience. And though we may never be aware of it as it happens, this unseen cleaning crew may be one of the most essential guardians of our mental well-being. There is a moment, familiar to a small number of people and astonishing to those who have never felt it, when the mind becomes aware of itself even while it dreams. The dreamer, instead of being swept helplessly along by the strange narratives that unfold each night, suddenly recognizes that the world around them, the shifting landscapes, the impossible events, the faces that change, and the laws of physics that bend is not real. And with that recognition comes an extraordinary shift in perspective. The dreamer is still asleep, still deep within REM. But consciousness has re-entered the scene, and the dream is no longer a stage controlled entirely by the unconscious mind. This phenomenon, known as lucid dreaming, has fascinated philosophers, poets, and mystics for centuries, but only in recent decades has it been approached as a subject of rigorous scientific study. The concept itself is ancient. The philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, noted that sometimes when dreaming we are aware of the fact that we are dreaming, and in the 8th century, Tibetan Buddhist texts described practices intended to cultivate this awareness as part of spiritual training. But for most of history, lucid dreaming remained anecdotal, an intriguing curiosity rather than a scientifically accepted reality. That began to change in the late 20th century, thanks largely to the work of a Stanford psychophysiologist named Stephen Lahberg. In the 1970s and 1980s, Lahberg devoted himself to studying lucid dreams under controlled laboratory conditions, determined to prove that they were not myths or misinterpretations, but measurable, reproducible states of consciousness. The key challenge was communication. A dreamer might claim to have become lucid, but how could researchers verify that the experience was happening while the subject remained asleep? Laberge's solution was ingenious. He trained lucid dreamers to perform specific eye movements, for example, moving their eyes left and right in a predetermined pattern once they became aware they were dreaming. Because eye muscles are not paralyzed during REM sleep, these movements could be detected by electroculograph sensors and recorded on a graph in real time. In 1981, Laberge successfully demonstrated that dreamers could send these deliberate signals from within a dream, providing the first concrete evidence that lucidity was real, and that conscious awareness could exist alongside the unconscious processes of dreaming. The findings, published in journals like Perceptual and Motor Skills, marked a turning point in sleep science, opening a door to a realm once thought inaccessible to objective measurement. Once the existence of lucid dreaming was established, researchers began to explore its potential uses, and what they found was as practical as it was profound. One of the most significant applications has been in the treatment of chronic nightmares, especially those associated with trauma. People suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder often experience recurring nightmares that replay aspects of their traumatic experiences, leaving them exhausted and fearful of sleep. Lucid dreaming offers a way to break this cycle by learning techniques to recognize when they are dreaming, often through reality checks during the day or the practice of wake back to bed methods. Individuals can gain enough awareness within the dream to alter its course. A nightmare that once ended in helplessness can be rewritten. The dreamer might choose to confront a pursuer, fly away from danger, or transform a threatening figure into something harmless. Over time, these changes can reduce the frequency and intensity of nightmares, giving sufferers a sense of control over what once felt. It's uncontrollable, but the benefits of lucid dreaming are not limited to therapy. Researchers have also investigated its potential for creative problem-solving and skill development. Because the brain's motor regions activate during dream movement almost as they do during waking movement. Practicing a physical skill in a lucid dream may strengthen the neural pathways involved. Experiments conducted in the 2010s by Daniel Erlacher and colleagues at the University of Bern found that people who practiced tasks like tossing coins into a cup or performing piano sequences during lucid dreams showed measurable improvement when awake. Writers, artists, and inventors have also reported using lucid dreams as laboratories for creativity, exploring visual ideas, narrative possibilities, or conceptual models in a world unconstrained by physical reality. The surreal but controllable nature of lucid dreams makes them fertile ground for imagination, allowing the mind to experiment without limits. The ability to become lucid is not evenly distributed. Some people experience it spontaneously throughout their lives. Others must train diligently to achieve it. Common techniques include keeping a detailed dream journal to improve recall, performing frequent reality checks during the day, such as looking at one's hands, or reading text twice to see if it changes, and using mnemonic devices before sleep to set the intention of recognizing a dream state. Even with practice, lucidity often occurs only a few times a month for most people. Though dedicated practitioners can achieve it more frequently, the rarity of the experience may be part of its appeal. It feels like a hidden door within the mind, one that does not open easily, but offers a vast landscape once it does. Scientific interest in lucid dreaming continues to grow, with researchers now investigating how it might illuminate deeper questions about consciousness itself. The fact that self-awareness, long considered a hallmark of waking thought, can emerge within a dream challenges simple divisions between conscious and unconscious states. It suggests that awareness is not tied strictly to external stimuli, but can exist independently, constructed by the brain even when cut off from the physical world. Some scientists see lucid dreaming as a model for understanding altered states of consciousness, from hypnosis to anesthesia to the peculiar experiences reported during near-death events. What began as an obscure curiosity has thus evolved into a powerful tool, one that bridges the gap between the unconscious landscapes of sleep and the deliberate agency of waking life. Through lucid dreaming, the mind reveals its capacity not only to imagine but to intervene, to reshape its inner world, and in doing so, change how it experiences the outer one. Whether used to heal wounds, refine skills, solve creative problems, or simply explore the vastness of its own potential. Lucidity reminds us that sleep is not a surrender to darkness, but a continuation of consciousness in another form. A place where awareness, once thought to vanish each night, learns to awaken again. For centuries, dreams existed in a space that was entirely private, sealed within the walls of the individual mind and known to others only through the imperfect act of storytelling. They were intangible, fleeting, and deeply personal, glimpses of inner worlds that could never be fully shared or measured. But in recent decades, the boundaries of that privacy have begun to blur. As advances in neuroscience and artificial intelligence have given researchers tools to peer into the dreaming brain in ways that were once unimaginable. Using technologies such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, scientists have taken the first tentative steps toward decoding the hidden content of dreams, pulling rough visual impressions from the mind's inner theater and raising profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the future of technology, and the sanctity of our most intimate experiences. The early attempts to read dreams began not with sleep, but with waking perception. In the mid-2000s, teams in Japan and the United States began training fMRI machines to recognize patterns of brain activity associated with viewing specific images. In one landmark experiment in 2011, neuroscientists Yukiyasu Kamitani and Shinji Nishimoto at Kyoto University showed volunteers hundreds of photographs and animals, faces, buildings, landscapes, while scanning their brains. They then used sophisticated algorithms to map the relationships between visual stimuli and neural activity in the visual cortex. Once the system had been trained, researchers presented new images and were able to reconstruct blurry, low-resolution versions of what the participants were seeing based solely on their brain activity. These reconstructions were crude, little more than hazy outlines and patches of light and shadow, but they were unmistakably related to the original images, demonstrating that the brain's visual experiences left detectable signatures that could, in principle, be deciphered. The next step was to see whether those same principles could be applied to dreaming. In a 2013 study, Kamitani's group placed sleeping volunteers inside fMRI scanners and woke them periodically during early stages of sleep to ask what they had been dreaming about. Over time, the researchers built a database linking specific patterns of brain activity to categories of dream content: cars, people, animals, indoor scenes, outdoor scenes, and so on. When the participants fell back asleep, the algorithm could predict with surprising accuracy, often above 60%, what kind of images were appearing in their dreams based purely on real-time neural data. It was a breakthrough that moved dream science from the realm of subjective report into something approaching objective measurement. The dream world, long thought untouchable, was now producing data that could be analyzed, cataloged, and even, in a rudimentary way, visualized. This progress coincided with rapid advances in artificial intelligence, which opened new possibilities for decoding the complexities of the dreaming mind. By training deep neural networks, machine learning, models inspired by the structure of the brain, researchers could now process enormous amounts of neural data and find subtle patterns that older statistical techniques might miss. Some labs began experimenting with combining fMRI or electroencephalography data with generative AI, systems capable of producing images from text prompts. The idea was that if a computer could identify the likely content of a dream from neural activity, it could then generate a visual approximation of that dream. Early results were far from cinematic. They resembled abstract paintings more than inner movies. But they hinted at a future where it might be possible to watch a recording of one's own dream, or even someone else's. Such possibilities have captured the imagination of scientists and storytellers alike. But they have also sparked intense ethical debates about the privacy of sleep and the potential misuse of technology. Dreams are not simply random neural noise. They often contain the most personal and vulnerable aspects of a person's inner life, their fears, desires, memories, and fantasies, sometimes even those they would never willingly share. If technology advances to the point where dreams can be decoded with high fidelity, who will have access to that information? Could employers, governments, or law enforcement agencies one day demand a peer into a suspect's sleeping mind? Could advertisers attempt to mine dreams for data on subconscious preferences? These questions, once the stuff of speculative fiction, are now being taken seriously by ethicists and legal scholars. Some argue that the act of decoding dreams should be treated as a form of mental surveillance, requiring strict legal protections similar to those that govern genetic data or privileged communication. Others point out that even consensual use carries risks, as people might underestimate the emotional consequences of seeing their unconscious thoughts rendered visible. There is also the question of authenticity. If AI-generated dream reconstructions are influenced by the biases of their training data or the limitations of the decoding algorithms, they might not represent what the dreamer actually experienced, leading to misunderstandings or false conclusions. Yet despite these concerns, research continues. Driven by the promise of new insights into the nature of consciousness and the functioning of the brain, dream decoding could one day help psychiatrists understand how emotional processing differs in people with trauma or depression, or assist patients with degenerative diseases by providing glimpses into cognitive decline before symptoms become severe. It might even enable new forms of communication, allowing people who cannot speak because of paralysis, coma, or severe neurological injury to express themselves through the language of dreams. The idea of machines that can read and reconstruct our dreams remains, for now, more science fiction than science fact. The images pulled from the brain are still faint and imprecise, the algorithms limited by the vast complexity of human thought. But the trajectory is unmistakable. Each year brings sharper reconstructions, more nuanced interpretations, deeper integration of neuroscience with artificial intelligence. As these technologies advance, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a profound shift in how we understand the boundary between public and private, conscious and unconscious, waking life and the inner theater of sleep. For the first time in history, the dream, once a fleeting whisper from the depths of the mind, is beginning to leave a trace in the external world. And with it comes both the excitement of discovery and the weight of responsibility. There is a peculiar and fragile state that exists on the edges of sleep, a liminal zone where the mind has not yet fully surrendered to unconsciousness, but is no longer bound by the rigid logic and constraints of waking life. Scientists call the descent into this state hypnagogia and the slow return from it hypnopompia, and together they form the borderlands of sleep, a region that is neither here nor there, where reality becomes soft and malleable, where ideas appear and dissolve like clouds, and where, for reasons still not fully understood, creativity seems to flourish with a force and clarity that often eludes us in ordinary consciousness. It is a fleeting window, lasting only moments before sleep takes over completely. Yet it has played a remarkable role in human thought and invention, shaping discoveries, artworks, and ideas that might never have emerged in the harsh light of day. The sensations of hypnagogia are familiar to almost everyone, even if few know the name. It is the drifting feeling that comes just as the body begins to relax, and the thoughts of the day lose their coherence, replaced by strange images that rise unbidden, flashes of landscapes, faces, symbols, or scenes that seem to come from nowhere. Sometimes there are bursts of sound, snippets of conversation, or the sense of falling that jolts the body awake in a hypnic jerk. During hypnopompia, the reverse transition as we awaken, these phenomena can be equally vivid, with dreamlike imagery bleeding into waking awareness. Because these states occur when the brain is partially awake and partially asleep, they represent a unique neurological condition, one in which the boundaries between conscious control and unconscious generation blur. It is this blurring, researchers believe, that makes them such fertile ground for creative thought. Throughout history, artists, scientists, and inventors have tried to harness the potential of this in-between state, deliberately courting it as a source of inspiration. One of the most famous practitioners was Thomas Edison, who in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was known for his relentless pursuit of new ideas and his belief that the key to invention lay not only in hard work, but also in cultivating the mind's more mysterious processes. Edison would often sit in a chair holding a pair of steel balls in his hands, resting them just above metal pans on the floor. As he drifted towards sleep, his muscles would relax. The balls would drop with a loud clang, and the noise would wake him instantly, catching him at the threshold of unconsciousness. In that brief moment, he claimed, he could seize ideas and insights that might otherwise have been lost. The surrealist painter, Salvador Dali, used a similar technique, replacing the steel balls with a metal key and the pans with a plate placed just below his chair. As he nodded off after long hours of work, the key would fall, striking the plate and waking him in that delicate hypnagogic state. Dali believed this practice, which he described in his 1948 book, 50 Secrets of Magic Craftsmanship, allowed him to access what he called slumber with a key, a realm where the subconscious mind offered up images and concepts that could later be refined on the canvas. The technique worked well enough that he credited many of his most iconic, dreamlike compositions. With their melting clocks and distorted figures, two insights gathered from this narrow space between sleep and wakefulness. Scientists have studied this phenomenon and found that the hypnagogic state is indeed characterized by a unique pattern of brain activity. Electroencephalograms show a mix of alpha and theta waves, suggesting that the brain is shifting gears from focused attention to a more fluid, associative mode of thinking. In this state, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logical reasoning and self-monitoring, becomes less active, while regions involved in memory, imagery, and emotion remain highly engaged. This loosening of control may explain why hypnagogic thoughts often take the form of unexpected connections, metaphors, or solutions to problems that have resisted conscious effort. Without the filtering and censoring mechanisms of full wakefulness, the mind is free to wander and recombine ideas in novel ways. Modern research supports the anecdotal evidence that this twilight zone of consciousness can boost creativity. A 2021 study led by Delphine Audiet at the Paris Brain Institute invited participants to solve a challenging mathematical problem, one that most found difficult when fully awake. After a brief nap in which they were awakened during the hypnagogic phase, many participants suddenly discovered the solution with surprising ease, suggesting that the state had primed their brains to think differently. The findings echoed what Edison and Dali had intuited decades earlier, that the borderlands of sleep are not just a passive stage on the way to dreaming, but an active cognitive space where the mind reorganizes itself in subtle and powerful ways. For some, hypnagogia and hypnopompia also provide access to deeply personal insights, because the mind is relaxed and unguarded. Memories long forgotten or emotions long suppressed can rise to the surface, sometimes in symbolic form. Writers have reported entire storylines arriving in flashes during these states, while scientists like Dmitry Mendeleev, who dreamed the structure of the periodic table in 1869, may well have been drifting in and out of this borderland when inspiration struck. Even Albert Einstein was said to rely on hypnagogic naps to work through the complex thought experiments that formed the foundation of his theories of relativity, despite its potential. This state remains elusive, precisely because of its brevity and instability. Too much relaxation, and the mind slips fully into sleep. Too little, and it remains tethered to waking concerns. Yet it is in this fragile balance that the greatest potential lies, a place where the unconscious mind and the conscious intellect briefly meet and collaborate. In those moments, the rigid structures of logic give way to fluid patterns of association, and the impossible can briefly seem possible. The borderlands of sleep remind us that the mind is not divided into separate territories of wakefulness and dreaming, but is instead a continuum, and that some of its most remarkable work takes place not at the extremes, but in the narrow spaces in between. For most of the 20th century, scientists studying the mind and consciousness worked comfortably within the framework of classical physics. The brain was viewed as a biological machine, its workings reducible to the electrical signals of neurons, the chemical pulses of neurotransmitters, and the complex networks they formed through synaptic connections. Thought, memory, and awareness were explained as emergent properties of this immense computational system. Intricate, yes, but ultimately mechanical. Yet even as neuroscience advanced, a deeper mystery remained unresolved. Why and how a collection of atoms arranged into cells should give rise to subjective, experience the vivid, first-person quality of being aware. This puzzle, known as the hard problem of consciousness, prompted some scientists and philosophers to look beyond classical explanations and toward the strange, counterintuitive world of quantum physics. Among the most prominent of these figures are the British mathematician and physicist Roger Penrose and the American anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, whose collaboration since the 1990s has given rise to one of the most debated and polarizing ideas in modern science: the theory of orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCOR. Penrose, a Nobel laureate best known for his work on black holes and general relativity, argued in his 1989 book, The Emperor's New Mind, classical physics could never fully explain consciousness, because the act of conscious understanding seemed to involve processes beyond algorithmic computation. He pointed to the strange behavior of quantum systems, particles that exist in multiple states simultaneously, that can become entangled across vast distances, that seem to collapse into definite outcomes only when observed, and suggested that consciousness itself might arise from quantum-level events occurring inside the brain. Hameroff, whose research focused on the structure of neurons, proposed a possible physical basis for this idea: the microtubules, tiny cylindrical structures that form part of a cell's cytoskeleton. Microtubules, he argued, were not just scaffolding, but highly ordered, lattice-like structures capable of supporting coherent quantum states. Together, Penrose and Hameroff proposed that quantum superpositions occurring within microtubules undergo a special kind of collapse. Objective reduction, orchestrated by biological processes in the brain. This collapse, they suggested, might be the physical mechanism underlying moments of conscious awareness. The ORCOR model was bold, imaginative, and deeply controversial. Quantum mechanics, after all, typically operates at scales far smaller than neurons and at temperatures close to absolute zero, conditions far removed from the warm, wet, noisy environment of the human brain. Critics argued that quantum states would decohere, that is, lose their delicate superpositions almost instantly in such a setting, long before they could influence neural activity. Max Tegmark, a physicist at MIT, published a widely cited paper in 2000 calculating that any quantum coherence in microtubules would collapse in femtoseconds, far too quickly to affect cognition. Many neuroscientists dismissed ORCOR as speculative at best and pseudoscientific at worst, pointing out that no direct evidence for quantum effects in microtubules had been found. Yet despite the skepticism, Penrose and Hameroff's ideas refused to disappear, and in recent years, some experimental findings have encouraged a fresh look at them. Studies in quantum biology have shown that quantum phenomena can indeed play functional roles in warm biological systems. In photosynthesis, for example, excitons quasiparticles of energy appear to exploit quantum superposition to navigate complex molecular pathways with remarkable efficiency. In bird navigation, cryptochrome proteins in the retina may use quantum entanglement to sense Earth's magnetic field. If quantum effects can operate in plants and birds, some argue, perhaps the brain is not as inhospitable to them as once thought. Hameroff himself has cited research suggesting that anesthetic agents, which reliably switch consciousness off, act on microtubules in ways not fully explained by classical neurochemistry, hinting that something more subtle may be occurring at that scale. The debate over ORCOR has also expanded beyond neuroscience into philosophy and the foundations of physics. If consciousness is indeed linked to quantum state reduction, it might not be a mere byproduct of brain activity, but a fundamental feature of the universe, woven into the fabric of reality itself. Penrose has speculated that objective reduction might be a process tied to quantum gravity, meaning that moments of awareness could reflect the most fundamental interactions between space, time, and matter. This idea, if true, would bridge the gap between physics and phenomenology, suggesting that consciousness is not an emergent property, but a fundamental ingredient of the cosmos. Not everyone is convinced, and many scientists continue to regard the theory with skepticism bordering on impatience. Critics argue that the lack of empirical evidence, the speculative nature of the proposed mechanisms, and the tendency of Orko are to invoke poorly defined concepts make it more philosophy than science. Some dismiss it as a distraction from more fruitful lines of research, such as understanding how large-scale neural networks give rise to cognition or how brain dynamics create the unified field of experience we call the self. But even among those who reject it, there is often a grudging respect for the ambition of the idea, if only because it dares to confront questions that conventional neuroscience tends to sidestep. The divide reflects a broader tension in science itself, between the desire for theories grounded in established principles and the willingness to entertain bold, even improbable possibilities. When faced with profound mysteries, consciousness remains one of the most profound mysteries of all, an everyday phenomenon that still defies full explanation. Whether microtubules truly harbor quantum states, or whether ARCOR or any similar model will ever be confirmed, remains unknown. But the mere fact that scientists, as respected as Penrose and Hameroff, have pursued this line of thought, keeps the conversation alive. Their work reminds us that the search for understanding may require us to look beyond the familiar boundaries of biology and chemistry and into the deeper structure of reality itself, into a realm where neurons meet quantum fields, where physics and philosophy blur, and where the first flickers of awareness may arise from the most fundamental patterns of the universe. In the daylight hours, when we speak of the self, we usually imagine something continuous and stable, a single mind contained within a single body, a steady narrative thread that links the person we were yesterday to the person we will be tomorrow. Yet the more neuroscience has learned about the brain, and the more carefully it has examined what happens to that sense of self in sleep, the less certain that picture becomes. The self, it seems, is neither singular nor fixed. It is a construction, assembled moment by networks of memory, attention, emotion, and awareness, a construction that shifts dramatically when we drift into sleep and dream. The person we become in those internal landscapes is often someone else entirely, guided by different motives, shaped by different memories, and sometimes even unaware of the waking self that created them. In that sense, every night we dissolve and reassemble, dying in a small way as one self fades, and waking the next morning as something subtly new. The idea that the mind contains multiple selves is not just a metaphor, but a conclusion, supported by some of the most striking experiments in neuroscience. In the 1960s, researchers like Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga conducted pioneering work with split brain patients, individuals whose corpus callosum, the thick bundle of fibers connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, had been surgically severed to treat severe epilepsy. To their surprise, these patients seemed to contain two independent streams of consciousness. The left hemisphere, which controls language, could speak and explain decisions, while the right, largely silent, could act on its own information, guiding the hand to draw a picture or pick up an object that the left did not consciously perceive. In some cases, the two hemispheres even appeared to disagree, with one hand buttoning a shirt while the other unbuttoned it. These results suggested that what we think of as a single eye might in fact be a coalition of distinct systems, cooperating most of the time, but capable of functioning separately when divided. This multiplicity becomes even more striking when we consider what happens during sleep. The dreaming self often behaves in ways that would be unthinkable while awake, accepting impossible scenarios without question, shifting identities mid-story, or reacting emotionally to events that would barely register in daylight. Memory, too, operates differently. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for self-reflection and logical analysis, becomes less active, while deeper, older parts of the brain, the limbic system, and the amygdala dominate, shaping our dream selves around primal emotions and forgotten experiences. The result is a version of me that may feel familiar, yet is undeniably distinct from the self who navigates waking life. This nightly transformation has led some scientists and philosophers to propose that the self is not a fixed entity at all, but a process, a constantly updating model of the world and our place in it, one that changes with context and state. Each night, as consciousness slips beneath the surface, the waking self loses its grip, and a new version takes over, one that draws from a different pool of memories, associations, and motivations. When we awaken, the two versions merge again, though not without leaving subtle traces. Some dreams are forgotten entirely, some linger as vague impressions, and some, the most powerful, alter how we see ourselves. Even if we cannot explain why, the brain's shifting sense of identity has measurable consequences. Functional imaging studies have shown that during REM sleep, the brain regions associated with self-representation, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, show patterns of activity distinct from waking life. These changes may explain why we often do not question dream scenarios that contradict our waking beliefs or memories. They also reveal something deeper, that consciousness is not a singular, continuous stream but a mosaic of states, each with its own version of selfhood. Neuroscientists like Giulio Tonone, known for the integrated information theory of consciousness, argue that each of these states reflects a different configuration of informational complexity, a different way the brain integrates experience into awareness. The implications of this are profound. If our sense of self is fluid and context-dependent, then personal identity, the very thing we cling to as a core truth, is more ephemeral than we like to believe. Each morning, the memories and emotions of our dreams seep into waking life, influencing our moods, decisions, and even our sense of purpose. We are not quite the same people we were the day before because the brain has spent the night rehearsing, configuring, and rewriting aspects of who we are. The ancient philosopher Heraclitus wrote that no man steps into the same river twice, for it is not the same river and he is not the same man. Neuroscience suggests that the same is true of the self. We never wake as quite the same consciousness that fell asleep. Some researchers go even further, proposing that the coexistence of multiple selves, the waking self, the dreaming self, the reflective self that narrates experience, and the more instinctive self that acts, may be essential to human cognition. It allows us to simulate possibilities, explore alternate realities, process unresolved conflicts in ways that a single, fixed self could not. It may even be that the dreaming self plays a critical role in integrating our various experiences into a coherent identity, weaving together fragments from memory, imagination, and prediction into the continuous story we call a life. And yet, for all these scientific insights, there remains something deeply mysterious about the way consciousness shifts when we close our eyes. Dreams still feel like someone else's thoughts, even though they are our own. The person navigating those landscapes feels real, yet vanishes upon waking, leaving us to wonder who or what we really are. Perhaps that is the most unsettling and liberating truth neuroscience has revealed, that the self is not a fixed point, but a field. One that expands and contracts, appears and dissolves, dies each night, and is reborn with the dawn, always entangled with its other versions, always unfinished, always becoming. In the tense decades of the Cold War, when rival superpowers poured vast resources into every conceivable tool of advantage, from nuclear arsenals buried in silos to satellites that silently orbited above scientists and military, strategists also turned their attention to one of the most private frontiers of all, the sleeping human mind. It was an era in which the boundaries between science and espionage often blurred. In the dream state, once the domain of poets and psychologists, became a potential battleground for influence, control, and manipulation. Governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain wondered whether the mind, stripped of its usual defenses during sleep, might be uniquely vulnerable, and whether the narratives that unfolded there could be guided, altered, or even weaponized. The roots of this strange line of inquiry stretch back further than the Cold War itself. By the late 1940s, psychologists had begun to experiment with hypnopedia, or sleep learning, based on the idea that the human brain might absorb information while unconscious. Early studies, such as those by Lawrence Lashone and colleagues in the 1950s, attempted to teach simple vocabulary or arithmetic to sleeping subjects by playing audio recordings near their beds. The results were inconsistent. Most participants retained little to nothing of what they heard yet. The possibility that the sleeping mind could be influenced proved too tempting to ignore. Intelligence agencies and military laboratories, particularly in the United States and the Soviet Union, began quietly funding research into subtler forms of suggestion, exploring whether carefully timed cues could bypass the filters of waking consciousness and plant ideas that would later shape behavior. Some of the most secretive work in this field took place under the umbrella of broader mind control programs, such as the CIA's infamous MKUltra project, which operated from the early 1950s into the 1970s. While much of MKUltra focused on hypnosis, drugs, and sensory deprivation, declassified documents reveal that scientists also explored what they called night whispering, the use of audio messages delivered during specific phases of sleep to reinforce certain attitudes or weaken others. The thinking was that if the conscious mind could be bypassed, deeply rooted beliefs or memories might be altered more effectively. Soviet scientists pursued similar lines of inquiry, driven by fears that the West was developing psychological weapons. Research institutions in Moscow and Leningrad conducted experiments on sleep stages, language retention, and the possibility of influencing decision-making through subliminal auditory stimuli delivered during REM sleep, when the brain is most active and receptive. Parallel to these clandestine efforts were more public but equally ambitious experiments that sought to understand whether dreams themselves could be steered. Some psychologists believed that if external stimuli, sounds, smells, or even mild electrical pulses were introduced into the sleeping brain at precise moments, they might influence the content of dreams. In the 1960s, researchers at the Maimonides Medical Center in New York conducted a series of studies in which sleepers were exposed to suggestive cues, such as whispered words or specific scents, shortly before entering REM sleep. The participants were then awakened and asked to describe their dreams. While results varied, in many cases, the cues appeared to shape the dream narratives, suggesting that the boundary between external reality and the dream world was more porous than previously believed. The potential applications of such discoveries were as vast as they were unsettling. Military planners speculated about whether soldiers could be trained more effectively, if tactical knowledge were reinforced during sleep, or whether enemy operatives could be subtly influenced without their awareness. Some went even further, imagining scenarios in which targeted propaganda could bypass the conscious mind altogether, reshaping attitudes and loyalties without resistance. Yet for all the fascination, the results rarely lived up to the ambition. Sleep learning proved unreliable, and dream manipulation remained far too imprecise to be weaponized. Most attempts produced vague associations rather than concrete behavioral changes. And ethical concerns, even among hardened Cold War strategists, eventually cooled enthusiasm for the most extreme proposals. Still, the era left behind a legacy that continues to shape how scientists think about the sleeping mind. The research demonstrated that sleep is not a sealed state but a dynamic process, sensitive to external inputs and capable of integrating them into its internal narratives. It also revealed just how powerful and potentially dangerous that sensitivity could be if harnessed for manipulation. Even today, commercial and clinical research into sleep-based learning and therapy treads carefully on ethical ground. Haunted by the specter of those earlier, more secretive experiments, scientists investigating memory consolidation during sleep must now address not only technical challenges, but also fundamental questions about consent and autonomy. If the mind is truly open and vulnerable in sleep, what responsibilities do researchers have to protect it? This uneasy intersection of curiosity and control reflects a larger truth about human ambition. the same impulse that drives us to understand the mysteries of dreaming. To decode the language of the unconscious, and perhaps use it for healing, can just as easily lead us down darker paths toward manipulation and exploitation. The Cold War dream experiments are a reminder that the sleeping mind, though hidden and private, is not beyond reach, and that with each new insight into how it works comes the temptation to use that knowledge for purposes beyond science. In the end, they show us something profound about ourselves. That power over the human mind is most alluring, precisely where it is most vulnerable in the silent hours of sleep. When the self lets go of control and drifts into a world where suggestion and imagination blur, and it is there, in that narrow space between understanding and interference, that the story of dream research continues to unfold, balancing on the thin line that separates discovery from manipulation. For as long as people have dreamed, they have wondered whether those inner worlds are truly private, or if in some mysterious way they can be shared. Across centuries and continents, cultures have told stories of dreams that connect families, communities, or even entire peoples, blurring the boundary between individual consciousness and something larger. Long before modern science began probing the mysteries of the mind, traditional societies treated shared dreaming not as a metaphor but as a lived reality, a force that shaped relationships, guided decisions, and preserved ancestral knowledge. These beliefs were not naive superstitions, but sophisticated ways of understanding how the deepest parts of human experience might be interwoven. And they still resonate today in both psychological theory and the stranger corners of modern research among the Iroquois of northeastern North America. Dreams were considered vital channels of communication, not only between individuals but also between people and the spirit world. The Iroquois believed that dreams expressed the desires of the soul, that failing to fulfill a dream's wishes could lead to illness or misfortune. But these visions were not confined to individuals. During winter festivals, entire communities would gather to share and interpret their dreams collectively, sometimes acting them out in elaborate rituals designed to satisfy the soul's demands. These ceremonies, which could last for days, blurred the line between personal experience and communal responsibility, suggesting that dreams were not private property, but part of a larger social and spiritual fabric, half a world away. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia developed an even deeper and more enduring vision of shared dreaming, one that continues to shape their worldview to this day. Central to many Aboriginal cultures is the concept of the dreaming, or dream time, a complex spiritual framework that describes the creation of the world, the actions of ancestral beings, and the continuing relationship between people, land, and cosmos. In this tradition, dreams are not simply nocturnal visions, but a way of accessing a timeless, interconnected reality, where past, present, and future coexist. Individuals can encounter the same ancestral figures, visit the same sacred landscapes, and even participate in the same mythic events during their dreams, reinforcing a sense of shared identity that transcends the boundaries of the self. Elders teach that dream time is both deeply personal and profoundly collective, a realm where one's private visions are threads woven into a much larger story. The idea that dreams might connect people at a level deeper than conscious thought found new expression in the 20th century through the work of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, building on his studies of mythology, religion, and the unconscious. Jung proposed the concept of the collective unconscious, a shared layer of the psyche containing archetypes, or universal symbols, that recur across cultures and eras. These archetypes, he argued, are not learned, but inherited, manifesting in dreams as figures like the wise old man, the shadow, the great mother, or the hero. They emerge in myths, stories, and visions around the world, suggesting that beneath the surface differences of individual minds lies a common psychic ground. Dreams, in this view, are one of the primary ways in which that collective dimension expresses itself, offering glimpses into patterns and forces far older and broader than any single life. While Jung's ideas were controversial, many scientists rejected them as untestable. They resonated deeply with those who sensed that dreaming taps into something shared, And in the digital age, where people separated by continents can compare their inner experiences instantly, reports of what some call mutual lucid dreaming have added another layer to the mystery. Online forums and research groups devoted to lucid dreaming, the state of awareness within a dream, are filled with accounts of people who claim to have met, communicated, or even explored dream worlds together while asleep. Participants describe agreeing on a meeting place beforehand, a forest clearing, library, a moonlit beach, and then attempting to find one another there. In some cases, they report astonishingly similar details upon waking, describing the same scenery or the same conversations despite having no contact during the night. Such claims are impossible to verify under scientific conditions, and are often met with skepticism. Controlled studies attempting to demonstrate genuine dream-to-dream interaction have produced no definitive results, and most researchers attribute the phenomenon to coincidence, suggestion, or the brain's remarkable capacity to fill in gaps and create coherent narratives. Yet the persistence of these reports speaks to a powerful intuition that dreams might not be as solitary as they seem. Even if two people do not truly meet in a shared dream, the fact that their experiences can mirror one another so closely raises profound questions about how the human mind constructs reality and whether those constructions might sometimes overlap in ways we do not yet understand. The fascination with shared dreaming, whether in traditional societies, Jungian psychology, or contemporary online communities, reflects a deeper longing, the desire to transcend the boundaries of individuality and participate in something larger. Dreams, by their nature, dissolve the walls of ordinary perception, allowing us to experience time, space, and identity in new ways. It is perhaps inevitable that in those boundless landscapes, we should seek not only ourselves but also one another. Whether shared dreams or literal meetings of minds or metaphors for the deep commonalities that unite human experience, they remind us that the dream world is not simply a private theater, but a realm woven from collective stories, symbols, and longings. And in those moments when two dreamers wake with the same images lingering behind their eyes, we glimpse the possibility, however faint, that the borders of consciousness are more porous than we imagine, and that our sleeping minds may not be as alone as they seem. When humanity first began sending people beyond the thin boundary of Earth's atmosphere, it was not only the body's reactions to space that fascinated scientists, but also the subtler and more mysterious effects on the mind. Sleep, that most familiar and essential of human rhythms, became something entirely different when removed from the pull of gravity and the steady cues of night and day that have shaped our biology for millions of years. Astronauts quickly discovered that drifting off in orbit was not as simple as closing their eyes. The environment itself, weightlessness, isolation, the constant hum of machinery, and the absence of a normal day-night cycle altered the experience in ways that were both expected and profoundly strange. And within that altered state, dreams too took on new qualities, reflecting a reality far removed from anything humanity had known before. From the earliest missions of the Mercury and Apollo programs in the 1960s, NASA and other space agencies paid close attention to how astronauts slept, knowing that poor rest could compromise everything from reaction time to decision-making during critical operations. In the microgravity of orbit, the body no longer settled into sleep in the usual way. Instead of lying down, astronauts strapped themselves into sleeping bags attached to the walls of the capsule to prevent drifting. And without the pull of gravity on their muscles and joints, many reported sensations of floating even while unconscious, sensations that often bled into their dreams. Some described vivid dreams of flying or drifting through infinite space, while others reported disorienting claustrophobic visions, as if their subconscious minds were struggling to make sense of the strange environment. These accounts offered early hints that dreams, far from being sealed off from the physical world, were deeply influenced by the body's surroundings. Even in sleep, by the time permanent space stations like Mir in the 1980s and the International Space Station, ISS, in the 2000s became operational, sleep research in orbit had grown more sophisticated. NASA's Human Research Program, along with European and Japanese space agencies, began conducting systematic studies on circadian rhythms, the internal clocks that govern sleep and wakefulness, and how they adapt, or fail to adapt to life in space. On Earth, our bodies are synchronized to a roughly 24-hour cycle regulated by the rising and setting of the sun. But aboard the ISS, astronauts experience 16 sunrises and sunsets every 24 hours as the station circles the planet at 17,500 miles per hour. This relentless cycle of light and darkness can confuse the body's natural rhythm, leading to insomnia, fragmented sleep, and increased fatigue. To counteract this, engineers installed special LED lighting systems aboard the station that simulate dawn, midday, and dusk to help regulate astronauts' internal clocks. Even with these measures, studies published in journals like The Lancet Neurology and Sleep have shown that astronauts average about 6 hours of sleep per night, less than the recommended 8, and that their REM cycles, the stages most associated with dreaming, are often shorter and less frequent. The altered patterns of sleep have also raised intriguing questions about how flight might change the nature of dreams themselves. Some astronauts report that their dreams become simpler and more emotionally intense, dominated by primal feelings of awe, fear, or loneliness. Others experience recurring dreams about Earth, familiar landscapes, the sensation of rain, the smell of forests, as if their subconscious minds are trying to reconnect with the environment from which they are separated. There are even reports of dreams that seem to merge the ordinary and the cosmic. One astronaut described dreaming of walking through his childhood, home only to look out the window and see the curve of the Earth rising against a black sky. Such accounts hint at the profound ways in which the context of sleep shapes the content of dreams, and they suggest that long-term space travel might lead not just to new experiences of waking life, but to new inner worlds as well. These insights are more than curiosities. They are critical to planning future missions, particularly those that will take astronauts far beyond Earth's orbit. A journey to Mars, for example, could last between 6 and 9 months each way, and the psychological challenges of such a mission are immense. Scientists at NASA's Ames Research Center and the European Space Agency's Human Spaceflight and Exploration Directorate are already exploring how sleep and dreams might play a role in maintaining mental health on such journeys. One hypothesis is that dreams could serve as a kind of psychological ballast, helping astronauts process isolation, stress, and sensory deprivation by weaving these experiences into symbolic narratives. Another possibility is that controlled dreaming techniques, such as lucid dreaming, could be trained and used deliberately, not just for psychological well-being, but as tools for creative problem-solving. Rehearsal of mission tasks, or even navigation in unfamiliar environments. There's also speculation, though still highly theoretical, that in the distant future, dreams themselves might become part of how humans orient themselves in deep space. On Earth, our circadian rhythms are entrained to the planet's 24-hour cycle, but on Mars, a day lasts 24.6 hours. And beyond the solar system, human timekeeping may lose all connection to natural cycles. Some neuroscientists have suggested that dream cycles could provide an internal anchor for biological rhythms, a kind of neural clock that helps maintain psychological stability even when external cues are absent. It is a speculative idea, but one that underscores just how deeply sleep and dreaming are woven into the fabric of human life, and how essential they may be to our future among the stars, as humanity pushes further into space. The sleeping mind will remain one of its most enigmatic companions. In the weightless dark of an orbiting station, or the long, silent journey to a distant planet, dreams will continue to unfold, shaped by unfamiliar forces. Perhaps stranger and more revealing than any we have known on Earth, they will remind us that even in the most alien environments, the core of our humanity persists, whispering stories from the subconscious, guiding us through the unknown, and linking our most ancient rhythms to the infinite expanse beyond. And in those private voyages of the sleeping mind, we may discover that the frontier of space is not just out there in the stars, but also within, even in the safety of a locked room. With the lights turned off and the body wrapped comfortably in blankets, sleep does not always bring peace. Sometimes it becomes a stage for ancient fears to surface, fears older than civilization, older perhaps even than language itself. Across cultures and centuries, people have described terrifying experiences that occur in the strange, liminal space between sleep and waking, moments when they find themselves conscious but unable to move, when their hearts race and their chests feel crushed, when they sense a presence lurking nearby. These episodes, which modern science identifies as night terrors and sleep paralysis, are not new. They have haunted human beings for as long as dreams have existed, and they carry with them echoes of a much older biological memory, remnants of the primal vigilance that once kept our ancestors alive in the dark. Night terrors, distinct from nightmares, occur during the deepest stages of non-REM sleep, usually within the first hour or two of the night. Unlike a nightmare, which unfolds as a narrative within a dream, a night terror is a surge of raw panic, an eruption of fear so overwhelming that the sleeper may sit up screaming, eyes open but mind still trapped in a twilight state. Most who experience it, often children, though adults can suffer them too, have no memory of the episode the next morning. Yet to anyone witnessing one, the signs are unmistakable: rapid breathing, sweating, wild movements, and incoherent cries, as if the dreamer is fleeing from something invisible. Scientists believe these episodes stem from a misfire in the brain's arousal system. When parts of the limbic system responsible for fear and survival instinct activate, suddenly while the rest of the brain remains deeply asleep, the result is a body that reacts as if threatened, without understanding why. A vestige, perhaps, of an evolutionary past, when reacting instantly to danger in the night could mean the difference between life and death. Sleep paralysis, by contrast, occurs at the opposite end of the night, often during the transition between REM sleep and wakefulness. In REM, the body is intentionally paralyzed, a state called atonia, to prevent the sleeper from acting out their dreams. But sometimes the mind wakes before the body does, leaving the person trapped in a terrifying limbo, fully aware, yet unable to move or speak. This mismatch between consciousness and paralysis can last seconds or minutes. But in those moments, the experience can feel endless. Breathing often feels difficult, as if a weight is pressing on the chest. And many report vivid hallucinations, footsteps in the room, shadowy figures watching from the corner, whispers in a language they do not know. Throughout history, these sensations have been woven into folklore, interpreted not as neurological events but as supernatural encounters. In medieval Europe, sleep paralysis was often attributed to visitations by incubi and succubi, demonic beings said to sit on a sleeper's chest, stealing their breath or draining their vitality. In Scandinavia, the same experience was blamed on the Mara, a malevolent spirit whose name gave rise to the word nightmare. In Japan, it was known as kanashibari, bound in metal, a term reflecting the sensation of being pinned down by an unseen force. Among the Yoruba of West Africa, stories tell of witches who ride the sleeping bodies of their victims. And in more recent centuries, phenomenon has been reimagined as encounters with shadow people, or even extraterrestrial abductors. Though the cultural language changes, the underlying experience remains remarkably consistent. Paralysis, presence, and fear. Modern neuroscience offers a clear explanation for these ancient stories. During sleep paralysis, the dreaming brain remains partially active, projecting dream imagery into waking consciousness, while the body's motor system is still locked in REM atonia. The result is a hybrid state, part dream, part reality, in which hallucinations feel vividly physical. The sensation of a figure pressing on the chest, for example, likely stems from the body's natural struggle to breathe shallowly while paralyzed. The sense of a presence nearby may be the mind's attempt to interpret the overwhelming fear triggered by the limbic system. Even the footsteps and whispers are products of a brain trying to make sense of contradictory signals, blending fragments of dream and memory into coherent but terrifying illusions. Yet the fact that these experiences are explainable does not make them less powerful. And in many ways, their persistence reveals something important about the human mind. They show how deeply our bodies remember, not in the sense of conscious recollection, but in the reflexive circuits of survival that remain active even when the rational self is asleep. The surge of terror that accompanies a night terror or the suffocating dread of sleep paralysis are not random malfunctions. They are rooted in ancient neural pathways designed to detect threats, activate defenses, and prepare us for fight or flight. Even in the relative safety of a modern bedroom, far removed from the dangers our ancestors faced in the wild, those systems still awaken in the darkness, sometimes misfiring but always ready. Medical research into these phenomena has provided insight, not only into their mechanisms, but also into their broader implications for mental health. Studies have shown that sleep paralysis is more common in people who experience anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder, suggesting that heightened stress responses may prime the brain for such episodes. Similarly, night terrors often spike during periods of emotional upheaval, indicating a link between the sleeping mind's ancient alarm systems and the pressures of modern life. Treatments typically focus on improving sleep hygiene, reducing stress, and stabilizing sleep cycles. But there is also growing interest in using these experiences therapeutically, teaching sufferers to recognize and reinterpret them, transforming what was once a source of terror into an opportunity for self-awareness and resilience. In the end, night terrors and sleep paralysis remind us that sleep is not merely rest, but a complex interplay of biology, memory, and evolution. The body, even in its most vulnerable state, does not forget the lessons of its past. It remembers the rustle in the grass that might have been a predator, the heavy silence that could precede an attack, the need to be ready even when the conscious mind is at rest. And in those moments when fear erupts from the depths of sleep, when unseen hands seem to press against the chest and the walls of the bedroom, dissolve into something darker and older, we are reminded that the past is not gone. It lives on in our cells, our reflexes, and our dreams. For most people, dreams are ephemeral and harmless, strange narratives that unfold behind closed eyes and vanish with the morning light. They may frighten, inspire, confuse, or amuse us, but they rarely pose any danger beyond a racing heartbeat or a lingering unease at breakfast. Yet for a small number of people, dreaming can take on darker and more perilous forms, transforming from a private, inner experience into something that disrupts waking life, endangers the dreamer, and even threatens those around them. These edge conditions, narcolepsy, chronic nightmares, and REM sleep behavior disorder reveal the delicate balance that normally governs the architecture of sleep. And when that balance falters, they offer powerful insights into how and why we dream at all. Narcolepsy is perhaps the most striking example of what happens when the mechanisms of sleep misfire. It is a neurological disorder, first described in detail by French physician Jean-Baptiste Galino and Iba Baling, that disrupts the brain's ability to regulate sleep-wake cycles. People with narcolepsy may fall asleep suddenly during the day, even in the middle of conversation or while eating a meal. These sleep attacks can last only a few minutes or extend much longer, and they often bypass the usual stages of sleep, plunging the individual directly into REM. This rapid entry means that the vivid dream imagery normally reserved for the night can intrude upon waking consciousness, leading to hallucinations so realistic that patients sometimes cannot distinguish them from reality. Compounding the problem is cataplexy, sudden loss of muscle tone triggered by strong emotion, which can leave a person collapsing to the ground while remaining fully conscious. Together, these symptoms demonstrate how closely intertwined dreaming and wakefulness are not separate worlds but neighboring states that can bleed into each other when the brain's control systems falter, while narcolepsy blurs the boundary between sleep and waking. Chronic nightmares illustrate what happens when the content of dreams themselves becomes pathological. Nightmares are common in childhood and typically diminish with age. But in some people, they persist into adulthood and grow severe enough to qualify as a disorder. These recurrent dreams are not just unpleasant. They can trigger profound anxiety, sleep avoidance, and even cardiovascular stress. The causes are complex, ranging from trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder to medications, genetic factors, and disruptions in REM sleep. But the result is the same: a nightly assault from within. The classic example is the veteran haunted by combat dreams decades after leaving the battlefield, waking drenched in sweat with the echo of gunfire still ringing in his ears. Another is the survivor of a car crash who dreams again and again of the moment of impact, able to escape the memory even in sleep. In both cases, the dreaming mind seems trapped in a feedback loop, replaying traumatic events in an apparent attempt to process them, a process that, for reasons not yet fully understood, never reaches resolution. If nightmares reveal how dreams can torment the mind, REM sleep behavior disorder, or RBD, shows how they can endanger the body. Normally, during REM sleep, the brainstem sends inhibitory signals that paralyze most voluntary muscles, preventing the sleeper from physically acting out their dreams. But in RBD, which was first described in the scientific literature by neurologist Carlos Schenk and colleagues in 1986, this system fails. The result is a state in which the body mirrors the activity of the dreaming mind, sometimes with dramatic consequences. Patients may shout, punch, kick, leap from bed, or even run across a room while still asleep, their actions often reflecting the dream's narrative. One widely cited case involved a man who, dreaming of being attacked by wild animals, lunged out of bed and crashed through a nightstand, injuring himself and his spouse. Another described a woman who, dreaming she was fleeing a fire, jumped from a second-story window and broke both legs. Such incidents are not rare. Studies suggest that RBD affects up to 1% of people over the age of 60, and it is frequently associated with neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's, sometimes appearing years before other symptoms. The existence of these disorders has forced scientists to rethink many of their assumptions about dreaming and its role in human life. For example, the muscle paralysis of REM, once thought of simply as a safety feature, is now understood as a crucial part of how the brain integrates dreaming with bodily experience. Without it, the boundary between inner narrative and physical reality dissolves, and the results can be catastrophic. Similarly, the persistence of nightmares suggests that dreams are not random hallucinations, but part of a broader emotional regulation system, one that, when it breaks down, can trap the mind in cycles of unresolved fear. Narcolepsy, meanwhile, shows that the mechanisms controlling when and how we dream are deeply embedded in the brain's overall architecture of consciousness. They are not separate switches that can be turned on or off at will, but intricate systems that interact with memory, emotion, and perception in ways that science is only beginning to understand. These conditions also hint at the evolutionary origins of dreaming. The paralysis that RBD disables likely evolved to keep early humans safe from acting out. Threatening scenarios rehearsed in dreams, the emotional intensity of nightmares, may reflect a deep-seated need to confront and prepare for danger in a low-risk environment. And the strange hallucinations of narcolepsy, terrifying though they can be, showed that the dream-generating machinery is always ready, lying just beneath the surface of waking life, prepared to activate with the slightest shift in the brain's chemistry. In the end, these darker corners of dreaming remind us how precarious the balance of sleep really is. Most of us drift into dreams and emerge from them without incident, our bodies stilled and our minds exploring landscapes that vanish at dawn. But for those whose sleep goes awry, dreams become more than nightly stories. They become battles to be survived, puzzles to be solved, or dangers to be avoided. And in studying these extremes, scientists gain not only new tools to treat them, but also a deeper understanding of the mechanisms that make ordinary dreaming possible. The invisible systems that keep our bodies still while our minds roam free, that weave memory and emotion into stories, and that allow us, night after night, to journey safely through the dark in the final days or hours of life. When the body is failing and the mind appears to be fading, something extraordinary sometimes happens, something so unexpected and mysterious that it unsettles the neat boundaries between science, philosophy, and faith. Doctors and caregivers have documented countless cases of people who, after days or even weeks of deep confusion or unresponsiveness, suddenly awaken with startling clarity. They speak lucidly, recall forgotten memories, recognize loved ones they had not known for years, and often describe vivid dreams or visions in extraordinary detail. This phenomenon, known as terminal lucidity, has been recorded for centuries, from accounts in ancient medical texts to modern hospice records, and it suggests that the human mind, far from quietly dimming as death approaches, can sometimes flare brightly. Just before the final darkness, physicians have reported patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease who, after years of near-total cognitive decline, suddenly sit up in bed, call family members by name, and speak coherently about events from decades past. Others have described those in deep comas who awaken briefly to express love or offer parting words, only to slip away hours later. These moments of lucidity often come with descriptions of intense and elaborate inner experiences, landscapes of light, reunions with deceased relatives, or journeys through places that seem to exist outside time. Although science cannot yet explain how such mental clarity emerges from brains that are structurally devastated by disease or injury, one possibility is that dying itself triggers a cascade of neurological changes that temporarily reorganize brain function. In some studies, such as one conducted at the University of Michigan in 2013, researchers observed a burst of synchronized brain activity in rats in the moments. After cardiac arrest, a surge of electrical coherence stronger than anything seen during waking life. If a similar process occurs in humans, it could help explain why consciousness sometimes seems to sharpen just before it disappears. Closely related to terminal lucidity are the accounts of near-death experiences, or NDEs, reported by people who have come perilously close to death and then returned. These experiences share striking common features across cultures and ages. The sensation of leaving one's body and observing events from above, traveling through tunnels toward intense light, encounters with deceased loved ones or spiritual beings, and a profound sense of peace, timelessness, and expanded awareness. The term near-death experience was popularized by psychiatrist Raymond Moody in his 1975 book Life After Life, in which he cataloged dozens of such cases. Since then, researchers like Bruce Grayson and Sam Parnia have gathered hundreds more, some from people whose hearts had stopped for several minutes and whose brains, by conventional measures, should have been incapable of producing any conscious experience at all. Science offers several possible explanations for NDEs, though none fully accounts for the depth and consistency of the reports. One hypothesis is that they are the result of a final surge in brain activity, as oxygen levels plummet, similar to the burst seen in the Michigan rat study, producing hallucinations as the visual and limbic systems fire intensely. Another possibility is that the phenomenon is tied to REM intrusion, when dreamlike processes invade waking consciousness, creating vivid internal experiences even as the brain shuts down. Some researchers, like neurologist Kevin Nelson, have argued that this may explain why many NDEs resemble lucid dreams or hypnagogic visions, complete with out-of-body sensations and heightened emotional significance. Yet even if such experiences are produced entirely within the brain, their consistency and impact are remarkable. Many people who have had them report profound changes in their attitudes toward life and death, describing a lasting sense of interconnectedness, a diminished fear of dying, and a renewed appreciation for existence. What makes these final bursts of awareness so significant is not just their scientific mystery, but their philosophical weight. They challenge the simple narrative of a mind that gradually fades as the body fails. Instead, they suggest that consciousness, whatever its ultimate nature, may follow a trajectory that is anything but linear, intensifying even as biological life ebbs away. This raises deep questions about what consciousness is and where it comes from. Is it purely a product of neural activity, a complex but ultimately material process that ceases when the brain stops functioning? Or is it something more fundamental, something that can exist, if only briefly, in a state that transcends the physical structures that normally sustain it? Thinkers as far back as Plato and Plotinus speculated that death might be a kind of awakening, the release of consciousness from the body's limitations. Modern neuroscience is far from endorsing such metaphysical claims. Yet phenomena like terminal lucidity and near-death experiences keep that ancient question alive. Some scientists believe that studying these edge cases could illuminate the nature of consciousness itself. If the mind can surge with clarity in a dying brain, perhaps consciousness is not merely the sum of its parts, but a property that emerges under certain conditions that may become more pronounced, not less, as the system destabilizes. Others argue that these phenomena remind us of the brain's astonishing adaptability, its ability to reorganize and reallocate resources even in its final moments. Either way, the implications stretch far beyond medicine. They force us to confront our deepest assumptions about life, death, and the thin boundary that separates them. In the end, what happens in those final hours remains a profound mystery. The dying may glimpse landscapes no living person can describe, experience reunions that science cannot measure, or simply feel a deep, inexplicable peace as they cross the final threshold. Whether these moments are products of the brain's last electrical storms, or hints of something beyond the material world, they reveal an essential truth. The story of consciousness does not end neatly when the heart stops beating. Even as the body shuts down, the mind can blaze with one last surge of meaning, offering a window, however brief, into the deepest questions of existence. And in that window, for those who witness it or experience it, lies a quiet suggestion that death, rather than an abrupt end, might be the final transformation of the human experience. For all that science has uncovered about the sleeping mind, for all the electrodes placed on scalps, the magnetic fields pulsing through fMRI chambers, the algorithms decoding signals, and the bold speculations about quantum processes within the brain, dreams remain among the greatest mysteries of human existence. We have charted their landscapes in partial glimpses, traced their outlines in neural data, and cataloged their patterns across cultures and centuries. Yet what they truly are, and why they exist at all, continues to elude definitive explanation. In some ways, the more we learn, the deeper the mystery becomes. As if each discovery only opens another door to a room we had not known was there, each experiment revealing layers beneath layers, like a map that keeps unfolding beyond the horizon. It is remarkable how far our understanding has come in just over a century. At the dawn of the 20th century, scientists knew almost nothing about the mechanics of sleep. Dreams were the province of poets and mystics, or the subject of early psychological speculation like that of Sigmund Freud, who in 1899 called them the royal road to the unconscious. By the mid-20th century, technology had changed everything. Electroencephalography, pioneered by Hans Berger in the 1920s and 1930s, revealed that the sleeping brain was not silent at all, but alive with rhythms, alpha waves, delta waves, intricate oscillations that reflected hidden cycles of rest and restoration. In 1953, Eugene Osirensky and Nathaniel Kleitman identified rapid eye movement, the stage of sleep most closely linked with vivid dreaming, overturning the assumption that sleep was a simple, uniform state. Decade by decade, a clearer picture emerged. Sleep is a dynamic, multi-layered process. Dreams are not random noise, but deeply intertwined with memory, emotion, and learning. And yet, even with this knowledge, the heart of the mystery remains intact. We still cannot fully explain how the firing of neurons gives rise to the immersive worlds that unfold each night, worlds with their own logic, geography, characters, and stories. We do not understand why some dreams are forgotten instantly, while others linger for a lifetime. We cannot say why dreams sometimes solve problems, inspire art, or predict breakthroughs, and at other times seem to be meaningless nonsense. Some researchers argue that dreams are evolutionary tools, simulations of threats and challenges that allow us to rehearse responses in a safe environment. Others see them as crucial for memory consolidation, the brain's way of sorting and integrating the vast streams of experience gathered during the day. Still others view them as byproducts of deeper processes, the cognitive equivalent of steam rising from a boiling pot. None of these theories fully account for the complexity and variability of dreaming. In recent decades, The frontiers of dream science have pushed into even stranger territory. Functional MRI scanners have allowed researchers to watch the dreaming brain in action, identifying which regions light up as we navigate dream worlds or feel intense emotions within them. Some neuroscientists, like Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch, have explored the possibility that consciousness, and therefore dreaming, arises from the integration of information across vast neural networks, a phenomenon that cannot be reduced to the activity of individual cells. Others, like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, have proposed that quantum processes inside neurons might be involved in consciousness. It's an idea as audacious as it is controversial. None of these approaches has yet answered the fundamental questions, but each has expanded our sense of just how deep the puzzle goes. For all its scientific significance, dreaming is also something profoundly human, a nightly gift that belongs as much to art, myth, and memory as it does to neuroscience. Dreams are the stage on which our deepest fears and desires play out, the canvas on which we rehearse conversations that never happened, revisit places long vanished, and speak to people who are no longer alive. They allow us to heal from trauma by replaying and reframing painful events, to practice skills before we attempt them in waking life, to test possibilities we would never dare to explore otherwise. They tell stories we do not consciously author, weaving fragments of memory, emotion, and imagination into narratives that reveal more about us than we often realize. In their strange, non-linear logic, they remind us that the mind is not a machine of reason alone, but a vast landscape of metaphor, symbol, and wonder. Even now, with all our tools and theories, dreams retain the power to humble us. They remind us that inside each of us lies a realm as expansive and unexplored as any distant galaxy, a place that operates according to its own laws and rhythms beyond our deliberate control. We enter this realm every night without knowing exactly where it will take us or who we will be within it. Sometimes it offers comfort. Sometimes it confronts us with truths we would rather avoid. Sometimes it gives us visions so strange and beautiful that we struggle to describe them. And when we awaken, even if the details fade, something of the experience lingers, a trace of insight, a spark of creativity, a shift in perspective. It is possible that dreams will never yield all their secrets, and perhaps that is as it should be. They are reminders of the limits of knowledge, of the fact that not everything about the human experience can be measured, mapped, or explained. They connect us to something ancient and universal, linking us with every generation before us that looked into the darkness and wondered what unfolded there. They show us that even in the age of quantum computers and space telescopes, there are still frontiers within ourselves that remain unmapped. And so each night, when we close our eyes and surrender to sleep, we embark on a journey into that great unknown, a vast, uncharted continent inside us. One that offers no maps, no guarantees, and no final answers. Only the enduring promise of discovery.